In conspiracy circles online, there's long been this idea of predictive programming, which is essentially an Alex Jones level idea where the globalists or the oligarchs or whoever introduce ideas through media to make general audiences more susceptible to accepting them passively. This does happen, by the way, but with things like military oversight on film sets and Department of Defense propaganda like Jack Ryan. But in the more, again, conspiratorial examples, they used to try and push things like The Matrix being predictive programming, things like Minority Report, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Eyes Wide Shut, Blade Runner. There's actually a lot of Stanley Kubrick stuff. And the reason I start there is because while it's fallen out of style to point fingers at media for trying to passively get us to accept ideas about authoritarianism or evil overseers or a surveillance state, I don't think, however, there's been a movie in recent memory as outright propagandistic that fits the label of predictive programming like Mercy. Let's just look at this on paper. This is an Amazon production about a future police state where AI is used in place of a fair jury trial by peers to execute, the film shows, primarily homeless people and addicts. It is a film told almost entirely through product placement for things like cloud services, doorbell cameras, and biometric tracking. And if you see the concept of the film, where Chris Pratt plays a police officer who must prove his innocence to an AI judge, otherwise he will be put to death in an hour and a half, then you might think that there is some rich satire to be mined here, that surely the self-serious tone of the trailer just must be a misreading. There's no way a pro-police state, pro-AI film would come from one of the biggest megacorporations in 2026. We literally have law enforcement officers murdering US citizens in the streets and biometric data being used to track people without their knowledge or consent. There's got to be some sort of critique here, right? The closest thing the film ever comes to that, by the way, still manages to ring as more sinister than satirical. When Chris Raven, the main character, awakens at the beginning of the film, he has no idea where he is. He rouses to the noise of a commercial, basically, for the Mercy Court, which then proceeds to explain several core concepts of the film. The first is that crime in Los Angeles got so bad with rioters, looters, and drug addicts that the city created red zones, where all the criminals would essentially be kept. So within like 2 minutes, the movie is setting up a world where the police state is making actual ghettos and keeping all of these bad people like drug addicts. And it doesn't stop there, because then they established the Mercy Court, which isn't the name of the actual judge for some reason. I don't know why they thought that would be too on the nose. This is a movie about an uncritical authoritarian state initiative. And the opening of this film gave me some brief hope that this might go in a slightly RoboCop direction, because it's so ridiculous and cliched. But no, it takes and plays all of this uncritically and pretty seriously. After some imagery so jingoistic it would make Michael Bay blush, including a reel showing kids standing next to an American flag as the AI says something about defending our freedoms, and saying literally, quote, "The future of law enforcement is mercy," we get to the main thrust of the film, that Chris Pratt has been accused of killing his wife, and under this new Mercy Court system has an hour and a half to prove his innocence. This is very clearly an unfair way to handle any kind of trial, but one that the film is also too stupid to recognize how unfair it is. A better movie might have had more grappling with the inherent injustice of a system that sees people as basically cattle and is inherently inhumane, being run by an AI. The core concept undermines so much of this film, including the completely arbitrary timer ticking down on the screen, but you will see what I mean as this plot unravels. So after Chris Pratt does his best impression of Erica Kirk, learning that his spouse is dead, he sets about an investigation from the comfort of this seat in the middle of a room of green screens. He has total access to the cloud network that Mercy is involved in, and a minor plot point is how many cellular devices are hooked into the municipal grid or municipal cloud or whatever the hell it is. That is basically CTOS from the Watch Dogs game. And he just gets access to this entire surveillance panopticon for his trial for some reason. When people talk about predictive programming, this is the kind of thing I actually think they're onto. This is not presented satirically, like Starship Troopers, or even clearly as a Pandora's box future hypothetical situation like Minority Report, from which this movie obviously borrows. It's a massive plot point that this AI has access to all this data, can bypass phones and passwords, invade privacy, and collab data at any point. And the reason that feels so sinister is because it's not only the kind of shit that companies like Amazon develop and benefit from, but because it's actively becoming regular behavior in the American surveillance apparatus. In that context, so much of the film is sickening in its tone deafness. And the thing is, I don't know how many people who end up watching this will notice or even care, because this movie sucks. Credit where it's due. It's an interesting idea to tell a restrained thriller story through a variety of camera and surveillance footage. To have a ticking clock counting down as a main character has to solve their own murder or die. But in practice, much of this feels like someone just watching somebody else play a video game. It's not just because of passive similarities to games like Watch Dogs or the overall thin writing, but because most of the film is just a series of investigation sequences from the empty room that Chris Pratt is in, which dissolves into this fully augmented reality room at a moment's notice. There's actually a very funny point later in the film that this is used to comedic effect when there's an explosion and it just leaves him in the middle of this AR field where people are burning and dying all around him, like he's in a 40X theater at a funeral. Bizarre. So between that stuff and the crime scenes that constantly dissolve into Batman Arkham investigation scenes, there's also this one-shot, two-shot approach between the judge and Chris Pratt that reminds me a lot of Mass Effect games, where there's no real attention being paid to formatting, and is just done in the most flat, direct way to frame things possible. So after he wakes up, he freaks out, and we establish that Raven has a history with the Mercy program. In fact, this cop helped start it, and the Mercy Court has overseen 18 executions so far. If you're thinking that this is going to turn into like a Black Mirror episode where, you see, he was actually a bad guy, and now he gets his comeuppance, there's no such luck. And then we get footage from the previous day from his Ring doorbell camera showing that he yelled at his wife, went into the house, came back out, and then later she was found dead. Two things here. One, I am not joking about it being a Ring doorbell. The Ring logo is literally in the corner of the film for a non-significant portion. This film isn't just chock full of surveillance propaganda, but literally by name brand. Instagrams are stalked, texts are unlocked, iPhones are tracked, all hooked into this municipal cloud. The other thing is that Chris Pratt's character is a legitimate asshole the entire time, and we soon begin figuring out why. So I don't want to go plot point by point because much of this movie runs together. I'm not kidding when I say it feels like watching somebody else play a video game, but usually when critics say that, they mean it's more the choreography is boring or that there's just nonstop long sequences of action uninterrupted. The kind of films that at first look are indistinguishable for boomers from Call of Duty. Think Michael Bay's last two Transformers movies. But in Mercy, when I say it feels like a video game, I mean it feels like watching somebody else play a narrative indie game that might be interesting, but not to just sit there and watch. So much time in this movie is spent going through phone texts and conversations, looking at security footage like the cyberpunk brain dance sequences, and piecing together 3D recreations of crime scenes as Chris Pratt furrows his brow and we one-shot, two-shot, back and forth between him and the judge. If this were a video game, it might actually be more engaging. Putting someone in this impossible and ridiculous situation would make for a killer approach to adapting literature like Kafka's Trial, but this film isn't interested in critiquing the insidious nonsense of bureaucracy and law enforcement. It is interested in using it as an uncritical backdrop for a murder mystery that the worst episodes of CIA or Criminal Minds wouldn't piss on if it was on fire. Therefore, I will speed through some of the revelations we get as Chris meanders through other people's data. We find out he was an alcoholic deadbeat, standard for cops, but it was his partner who died that sent him on this path, and he got trauma because he couldn't handle it. And he got clean for a while with help from a sponsor named Rob, who also works the same job his wife does at a shipping yard, and eventually he fell off the wagon, and this caused problems with his marriage. Also, he goes through his daughter's phone and Instagram and finds her essentially sexting with some teenage boy. And then he gets shown footage of him getting into a fight at a bar and getting knocked out before being arrested. So when he wakes up, not only is he hungover, but maybe has memory impairment. They acknowledge this. And it takes, by the way, like a half hour to get to this point, which for a trial that is timed doesn't seem really fair. One fun piece of passive, legit propaganda comes when he's stalking his daughter's secret Insta account and he finds images of her being a political radical posting things against the mercy system that her dad supported. Again, it would be so much better in the hands of somebody who can recognize the inherent silliness of a future where AI shouldn't kill people, that's the job of the state, is essentially a left-leaning slogan. That's very goofy. But it's simply presented as being a naive, know-nothing child and aligned with political extremism, not so subtly. It also isn't brought up again. And eventually we get to some phone calls that all seem to play like, you guessed it, video game codec calls. He talks to Rob, his daughter, there's drama, and then after his daughter hangs up on him, he wants to give up and accept death at some point. He says the line, they only would approve mercy if it looked like people had an opportunity to defend themselves, which is basically admitting he knew the whole time this system wasn't meant to be fair, it was meant to be efficient. And here's the real moral quandary of the film. An AI judge with power over human life and death is objectively evil, but the film doesn't ever really engage with that. Again, it's entirely passive. Now, the marketing sells this as a Minority Report ripoff, and like in that movie, where the authoritarian technology is turned back on a member of the authoritarian state. But the problem here is that the system is shown to basically work as intended. Chris does, spoilers, prove his innocence. The AI helps him track down the real killer. So it is unfair, but also works if you're innocent. Except, I guess, for those other 18 people or whoever died who weren't detectives. Some were shown to be disabled, addicts, disoriented in the video footage of them being executed. I'll talk a bit more about how this film openly dehumanizes homeless people and addicts because it is so fucking disgusting. But from what we see in the film, essentially 18 people were killed for what amounts to a AI publicity stunt. And they never really got the proper opportunity to defend themselves. So, for an example in this disparity, in the next scene, he walks the scene of the crime using his partner's phone to case the scene of his wife's murder. On one hand, none of the other victims of this AI had access to these skills or resources for the case, so they had no real hope of proving their innocence like an actual detective does. But then on the other, how are they already in a trial? How can the trial be called fair when they're still investigating the crime scene? Again, in more capable or just thoughtful hands, there could be really interesting questions about the perils of a panopticon state that treats humans as utterly disposable, not caring about crimes or victims, but using crimes to make example of people for basically publicity stunts, to make cops and politicians look better. But most of the film goes like this instead. Every scene has some point or another that left me scratching my head as to how it would even work or how any of it was supposed to function in tandem with each other part. In a narrative, you don't always need perfect cohesion to be interesting or engaging, but you do need a baseline of consistency, and this film has none from the beginning, and somehow it only gets worse as the runtime continues. We get one of the few action sequences when Chris discovers that his wife was texting some guy on a black market phone. As we get all this evidence and the suspects begin to line up, this thing starts looking a lot more like if Netflix had to do an adaptation of Danganronpa. In addition to a purely unlikable main character and a nonsensical plot, the consistent theme of mercy is astounding tone deafness. Here's a perfect example. It turns out that Chris Pratt's wife was cheating on him with, would you believe it, a black guy. So this buff Trevor Noah looking dude literally cucks the police officer. I laughed out loud in the theater at this. We get a whole scene where Raven's partner chases the guy, and then, speaking of tone deafness, they just beat the shit out of him. And Chris gets to talk to him, finds out that the guy was actually completely innocent. He didn't kill his wife. So then they continue beating the shit out of him and then arrest him, even though the judge said, oh no, he's cleared, he's innocent. And everybody just stands around while this happens. And we just watch a black dude being police brutality and like the AI judge, Chris Pratt, nobody is like, hey, this is wrong. What the fuck, dude? We then get a car chase scene as we flash back to Chris's partner Ray's death and dash cam footage from that day. One of the funniest things throughout the film is how the main character literally stumbles across his own backstory. Because the AI has access to all sorts of footage instead of regular flashbacks, we instead get him watching footage of tangentially related things. So he will just open up a file and it'll be like, oh, hey, it's my tragic backstory. Are we going to sit here and just watch it now together? Cool, cool. It's a side effect of this movie being kind of constructed like a video game, where the AI judge just leads Chris Pratt by the hand from one waypoint to another, basically prodding and pushing him to keep uncovering the truth, despite saying at the beginning that she's an impartial judge. So is she only helpful to cops? If she knows he's innocent, it must be based on data, so why doesn't she come forward with that? If she's pushing him in these directions, it must be for some reason, and she would know somehow that he was innocent. And if you just keep following this spiral of questions, eventually you just start shrinking into a corn cob. So in this backstory flashback, we find out why this guy turned into a techno-fascist supporting the Mercy program. It's because his partner's killer got off, and he didn't police brutality murder him when arresting him, and like he should have. So because the justice system doesn't always get it right, his thesis that's never pushed back against is that there basically shouldn't be a trial system where people can prove their innocence. Unless you're a cop with the resources of the state, then that system works in favor of you. So from here, the rest of the mystery unravels at a pretty rapid pace with very little of anything building on one revelation or the other. I reference shows like Criminal Minds, and that's more what this feels like, a formulaic series of excuses for twists where most of what happens next alternates between ridiculous and incredibly predictable. We go back through the footage and find out that Nicole was keeping tabs on somebody stealing a chemical from her shipping company, and they found out. Someone stayed in their house overnight to kill her, which is why nobody was found outside or breaking in. They go into the scandal and stuff, and it feels like going through the Doom 3 PDAs looking for a fucking door code. They find out that the chemical can be used to make meth, and that would go huge in the red zone. And then they show footage of cops literally like full speed plowing into a homeless encampment and just getting out and beating the shit out of people for no reason, which I bring up because the way homeless people are depicted would be embarrassing for Fox News. Not only are they often attached to terms like rioters to subtly create a feeling of familiarity and recognition of political activists to the audience, but they are shown very often to be entirely passive, falling and being beaten by officers. They are also then depicted as these morally debased people who you can't help at all, essentially vermin. It is utterly disgusting, and nowhere is this ever pushed back against. So you fast forward past a few boring ass plot points, and it turns out his alcohol sponsor Rob was taking the chemical. And when they raid Rob's house, he was building a bomb, and they find a literal copy of the anarchist cookbook. Again, there's this equating of anti-AI sentiment in this film with political radicalism and also being incredibly violent. And it's beyond parody, the propaganda. Here's a film where the primary villain is, we'll get to it, why he's rightfully aggrieved and wants to destroy the surveillance state. But the good guy is a righteous cop who upholds the surveillance state after showing that it might be flawed, but the system still works, damn it. So it turns out the first person the Mercy program killed was Rob's brother. This shipping yard manager then made a master plan to get this detective in the seat of the AI execution chair. Except again, this isn't meant to be a critical analysis of the system because the system is shown working in favor of the super smart hero cop asshole. So Rob's plan is to make a big bomb and then drive it downtown. He kidnaps Chris's daughter and plans to suicide bomb the Mercy Court, and he goes on a whole shooting rampage. Chris confronts him. The Mercy Court intervenes, has Rob try to mount a defense, but with Rob's incomplete info, it looks like his brother was a murderer until Chris's current partner shoots Rob, and it's obviously to shut him up because there was something fishy about that guy they brought in, and she's a crooked cop, and justice gets served in the end. I didn't give a shit about any of those. Before Chris gets released by the AI court, however, he had this moment that was like a logic off with the computer. It's like you used to see in old 60s episodes of Star Trek where Kirk would come across like a massive computer god and would give it weird hypotheticals to really brain trick it. This sequence is kind of like that, and it ends with him pleading that they should both be able to start over, and he equates the the system murdering innocent people. So what he says is, we've both made mistakes and now we can make up for them, basically. The difference between those two is that one of them was an alcoholic deadbeat and the other isn't a person. It's an AI that murdered 18 people who now we know, after the crooked cop revelation, there's no way to tell how many of those people were innocent. Those are not really equivalent. This film, however, has made many mistakes. That is at least true. He got that right, from the concept to execution. But chalking this film up to just mistakes and being a bad movie, I think, misses the real intent of why projects like this are even greenlit. This is propaganda in its purest form, using the language and appearance of law enforcement media to present what it will sell as a morally gray story, but what is actually in execution a very straightforward message. The message is the surveillance state is good, it works, cops are heroes, and they are there because of the dangerous people in society that can't be helped and will also hurt you if the cops aren't there. And in between those lines, there are several admissions, like the fact that many of these communities and events are incited because of the involvement of police and the unjust, inhumane court system. Yet it excuses these as necessary, unquestioning the entire way. It presents these ideas wrapped in the recognizable insignias of items we're already used to seeing in our daily lives. It's showing you the Instagram pages you scroll, the Ring doorbells in your neighborhood, the texts you think are hidden, and it's showing you that none of that is actually secret. None of your data is yours, and most people won't even question that aspect. And this programming brought to you by Amazon, of all places. This movie's terrible, but Alex Jones might want to check it out for what predictive programming actually looks like.